I paint winter, and I paint spring and summer, but there's my favorite. I just love to paint summer.
The most beloved painter in America harbored a secret. Concealed beneath the cheerful depictions of family life, Norman Rockwell harbored a secret that had the potential to jeopardize his career. In 1964, he created a depiction that elicited tears from adult men and prompted moms to cover their children's eyes. The photograph revealed the unpleasant reality of America that many preferred to ignore. Gallery proprietors declined to exhibit it. The newspapers refused to publish it. Rockwell proceeded to paint it, fully aware that it may jeopardize all he had constructed. The artwork that nearly jeopardized his career unveils the true essence of Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was born on February 3, 1894, in Harlem, New York City, at 789 St. Nicholas Avenue. His progenitors were Jarvis and Nancy Rockwell. His father was employed at a Philadelphia textile firm and remained in that position throughout his whole career. They were not affluent, yet they managed to subsist. Norman had an elder brother named Jarvis, and despite residing under the same roof, they were never particularly close. His father was Presbyterian and his mother was Episcopalian, resulting in a rather blended religious environment at home. Long before Norman's birth, his ancestry traced back to England in 1635, when John Rockwell arrived in America aboard the ship Hopewell and contributed to the settlement of Connecticut. From a young age, Norman exhibited distinct characteristics. At the age of 3 in 1897, he would sit silently and listen to his father read Charles Dickens aloud. It was not solely the narratives. It was the manner in which Dickens depicted individuals using language. Norman observed his father as he replicated illustrations from books. At that moment, an awakening occurred within him. His maternal grandfather was also an artist. Although he never earned a substantial income, he had to content himself with painting landscapes. However, the spark had already been transmitted. Their little residence was replete with narratives, illustrations, and subdued challenges. That is what molded him. By the age of 9 in 1903, Norman already perceived himself as an outcast. He was slender, awkward, and did not assimilate in school. He did not feel particularly connected to his parents. Drawing evolved to become his refuge, a domain he could govern. An intelligible concept. He dedicated hours to solitary sketching, and gradually, he employed comedy and exaggerated traits as a means to navigate the manner in which others treated him. In that same year, his family relocated from the city to Mamaroneck, a small village in Westchester County. It transformed everything. In Mamaroneck, Norman encountered tranquil streets, expansive skies, and unfamiliar faces. He began to develop an affection for the concept of small-town living. He developed an obsession with the oeuvre of Howard Pyle, a renowned illustrator of the era. Norman started accumulating pennies solely to purchase art supplies. His mother maintained a stringent religious household, although Norman continued to draw despite financial constraints. He observed his surroundings, faces, gestures, fleeting moments, and recorded them in his sketchbook. The amalgamation of urban and small-town life remained with him eternally. In 1908, at the age of 14, Norman made a significant decision. He graduated from high school and matriculated to the Chase School of Fine and Applied Art in New York. Each day, he commuted by rail to and from Mamaroneck. His family have limited resources, yet they provided him with the utmost assistance possible. At Chase, he studied life drawing, which included sessions with live nude models. That was a jolt for a youngster reared in such a stringent household, yet he persevered. He was resolute. In 1910, he transitioned to the National Academy of Design and shortly thereafter, to the Art Students League of New York. He studied under instructors such as Thomas Fogarty, George Bridgman, and Frank Demond. Fogarty instructed him in the skill of narrating stories through imagery. Bridgman instructed him in the precise depiction of the human form. That was the moment Norman ceased his pursuit of becoming a fine artist. He recognized that his talent was in illustration. He aspired to narrate tales that resonated with individuals. In 1912, at the age of 18, Norman secured his inaugural significant employment. Fogarty assisted him in securing a commission to illustrate 12 Tell Me Why stories by Carl Claudy. He received $150 for the task. It transcended mere financial considerations. That moment altered everything. His art attracted the interest of Edward Cave, who was developing Boy's Life magazine. Norman entered the office with optimism in his gaze. Cave provided him with an opportunity. He requested that he create illustrations for a camping handbook, ultimately producing over 400 images. Norman remained a slender 140 pounds and 6 feet tall, so emaciated that during World War I, the Navy subsequently disqualified him for being underweight. However, in 1912, that was inconsequential. His odyssey had commenced. In 1913, nearly a year later, Norman assumed the position of full-time art editor for Boy's Life. He was merely 19 years old. Such a position was unprecedented for an individual of such youth. He diligently produced numerous photographs that influenced American perceptions of the Boy Scouts. He rendered their uniforms impeccable, their expressions authentic, and their exploits indelible. His artwork gained such popularity that the Boy Scout calendar emerged as the best-selling calendar in the nation by 1929. This initial success did not engender arrogance, rather, it fostered caution. He understood the rapidity with which circumstances could deteriorate. Consequently, he exerted greater effort. In 1914, Norman formed a close friendship with fellow artist Clyde Forsyth. Both individuals were employed at Boy's Life and leased an antiquated barn that was formerly owned by the renowned Western artist, Frederick Remington. The studio resembled hallowed ground. Forsyth urged Norman to embrace further chances and submit his artwork to the Saturday Evening Post. They collaborated closely, motivating one another. Norman developed not only in proficiency but also in self-assurance. He had transcended his role as a mere Boy Scout illustrator. He was evolving into something greater. In 1915, at the age of 20, Norman persuaded his family to relocate to New Rochelle. It was a judicious decision. New Rochelle was the residence of premier illustrators. Artists such as Joseph Leyendecker, a significant influence on Norman, maintained studios at that location. The creative environment further motivated Norman. He forged new friendships, encountered mentors, and maintained proximity to the publishing industry in New York City. It was a financially precarious decision, however, it facilitated opportunities he could not have accessed otherwise. Subsequently, the year 1916 arrived. Norman was 22 years old. That year, all circumstances transformed. He ultimately submitted his work to the Saturday Evening Post. His inaugural cover was published in May 1916. It resembled a thunderclap. From the initial issue until January 1917, he had already created 6 covers for the Post. Individuals became aware. Life magazine published a full-page advertisement declaring the Post as the premier showcase in America. Norman's work was important to it. However, triumph arrived swiftly and intensely. By the age of 25, Norman was fatigued. He resigned from his position at Boy's Life to concentrate exclusively on the Post. At that time, he had previously created 25 covers and other illustrations. It was a tumultuous experience. Despite the outward appearance of perfection, Norman continued to grapple with internal doubt. Circa 1911, he began to experience profound insecurity regarding his appearance, his identity, and his position in the world. He once stated that his sole asset was his drawing ability, which, in his view, held little significance. Rather than surrendering, he channeled those emotions into his paintings, depicting individuals that appeared awkward, anxious, and disregarded. In doing so, he enabled millions of Americans to feel acknowledged. In the summer of 1916, Norman Rockwell wed Irene O'Connor, a schoolteacher 3 years his senior. He had recently released his inaugural cover for the Saturday Evening Post that year. They had minimal acquaintance when he proposed in a boarding house in New Rochelle. However, from the outset, circumstances appeared anomalous. Irene desired a conventional domestic existence. Norman was unable to cease working. He was fixated on his paintings and frequently immersed himself in his art, neglecting all else. They did not have offspring. Years later, he discreetly confessed a poignant truth. After some time of marriage, I saw that she did not love me. The marriage persisted for over 14 years. In 1929, just following the stock market crisis, they consented to take individual vacations. Irene subsequently initiated divorce proceedings in Reno. Despite the disintegration of his personal life, Norman was ascending to national prominence. Between 1916 and 1919, he produced 25 covers for the Saturday Evening Post, several of which included themes related to World War I. A child inquired whether a short man could serve as a soldier. His art was ubiquitous. Life magazine utilized him in full-page advertisements to promote subscriptions. Despite his success, Norman was but 22, and it had become overwhelming for him. He started experiencing anxiousness and felt unable to meet expectations. Clyde Forsyth observed that Norman occasionally disappeared for periods, fearing that others would forget him. By 1920, his artistic style was evolving. It appeared more sophisticated and less caricatured. He received commendations from prominent painters and had evidently developed under the mentorship of his instructor, George Bridgman. However, the pressure persisted. Norman succumbed to the burden and experienced what was discreetly referred to as a nervous breakdown. He needed to withdraw to recuperate. During this period, he developed a close friendship with the renowned illustrator, J.C. Leyendecker, an individual he admired. The breakdown was a turning moment. He was still in his mid-20s. Already bearing the burden of being the most esteemed magazine illustrator in America. As the 1920s progressed, Norman began to engage in activities beyond merely creating magazine covers. Big businesses wanted him for their advertising. In 1923, he created a Jell-O advertisement depicting an idyllic, smiling family in a cheerful kitchen. Such warmth would define his hallmark style. He was employed by several publications, including Literary Digest, Country Gentleman, Leslie's Weekly, Judge, and Life. These advertisements were lucrative and provided him the opportunity to experiment. Nevertheless, the strain never completely dissipated. In 1929, during their stay at Louisville Landing, he and Irene resolved to embark on separate summer excursions. Norman traveled to Europe to explore museums in France, Austria, and Spain. Upon his return, Irene informed him that she had developed romantic feelings for another individual. She sought a divorce. Despite Norman's propensity for flirting with women, the news profoundly affected him. The divorce was concluded on January 13, 1930. He promptly fled to Alhambra, California, where he resided with his friend, Clyde Forsyth. It was around that time that he created The Doctor and the Doll. During his visit, Forsyth acquainted him with Mary Barstow, a mathematics educator and budding author who was 14 years his junior. Norman wed her merely a few months thereafter. On April 17, 1930, in the garden of her parents. The couple subsequently had 3 sons, Jarvis, Thomas, and Peter. However, Norman's mental health was deteriorating once more. In 1933, he was admitted to the hospital for what was termed nervous fatigue. Millions of individuals viewed his creations weekly, although none were aware of the anguish he bore. That year, he persuaded Mary to accompany him to Europe, aiming to rekindle his romance. They brought their 5-month-old baby, Jarvis. He studied Rembrandt and other great masters in Paris. However, rather of experiencing inspiration, he descended into a state of sadness. He began to refer to himself as a fraud. He perceived his Saturday Evening Post covers as insignificant in comparison to the esteemed works of the great artists in the museums. His thoughts became so bleak that he contemplated suicide. The journey inflicted a profound wound. In 1935, a novel opportunity emerged. He was requested to produce pictures for Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Initially, he was reluctant to proceed, but he ultimately acquiesced. He journeyed to Hannibal, Missouri, to examine Twain's birthplace and captured numerous reference photographs, a practice uncommon among serious artists. The illustrations were released in 1936 and 1940, but, upon reflection, he experienced discomfort. Certain drawings exhibited nuanced racial stereotypes. As time progressed and the civil rights movement intensified, Norman acknowledged his remorse for the depiction of some people. Near 1938, Norman and Mary purchased a 60-acre farmhouse near Arlington, Vermont. They desired a tranquil existence for their family, and initially, it appeared ideal. They attended square dances and town meetings, yet, beneath the facade of smiles, disarray was ensuing. Mary's alcohol consumption had deteriorated. Norman documented in his journal her increasing distance and anger when she used alcohol. He was unable to derive pleasure from even the most basic activities, such as swimming in the river on their property. He said the water was very cold, however, the reality was that he was perpetually nervous. In 1939, Norman commenced therapy with Erik Erikson, a renowned psychiatrist who had fled Nazi Germany. Erikson assisted him in recognizing that numerous joyful paintings served as a means of healing from a solitary upbringing. Norman's mother had exhibited a frigid and aloof demeanor. Throughout his upbringing in New York, he consistently felt a lack of belonging. His depictions of joyful, affectionate families were what he desired for himself. The therapy facilitated his comprehension of that. It provided him with the fortitude to continue creating meaningful art. In 1942, he conceived a concept for 4 paintings inspired by President Roosevelt's discourse on freedom: liberty of expression, liberty of religion, freedom from deprivation, and freedom from apprehension. He proposed them to the Saturday Evening Post, but they were unenthusiastic. Despite concerns that the concept could disturb readers, Norman was so convinced of its merit that he financed the project personally. He utilized his neighbors in Vermont as subjects and dedicated months to the painting. In 1943, the 4 Freedoms toured 16 cities and generated $132 million in war bonds, equivalent to nearly $2 billion today. More than 1.2 million individuals viewed the paintings. Norman appeared to sign prints. However, not all individuals were content. A segment of the American populace expressed indignation at the freedom of worship painting, which depicted individuals of diverse ethnicities and religions engaging in prayer collectively. Rockwell got vitriolic correspondence accusing him of endorsing racial integration and communist ideologies. Certain Southern communities declined to exhibit the posters. Nonetheless, the tour was an immense success. In that same year, a dreadful event occurred. In late 1943, Norman's entire studio was consumed by fire. He lost hundreds of paintings, props, costumes, and all his personal belongings, valued at approximately $100,000 at that time, exceeding $1.5 million today. Several neighbors asserted that it was an incident caused by his pipe ashes. Others, including Norman, felt it could have been an act of arson. He had disputes with a neighbor regarding property boundaries. No one has ever substantiated any claims. The loss of his work, materials, and cherished pipes was paramount. Disappeared overnight, the townspeople presented him with new pipes as a gesture of affection. In 1943, he also created the painting Rosie the Riveter for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Rosie exhibited strength and confidence as she crushed Hitler's book beneath her foot. She was inspired by a 19-year-old telephone operator named Mary Louise Doyle. Norman exaggerated Rosie's size compared to her actual model, a decision he subsequently regretted. Although the image attained iconic status, numerous male readers expressed outrage. They deemed it unnatural and terminated their magazine subscriptions. They opposed the presence of women in positions traditionally designated for men. However, Norman had already contributed to the formation of a novel archetype of American heroism. Amidst this triumph, his marriage was deteriorating. Mary's alcohol consumption deteriorated over the 1940s and 1950s. She required psychiatric treatment at the Austin Riggs Center. The journey from their residence in Vermont lasted 90 minutes. Occasionally, she resided there for several months. In 1952, she underwent electroconvulsive treatment. Norman experienced solitude. He discovered emotional sustenance in the women he depicted, establishing intimate, subtle bonds that facilitated his survival. In 1953, they relocated to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to facilitate Mary's proximity to the treatment institution. Norman entered therapy to manage the burden of celebrity, pressure, and domestic sorrow. In 1946, Norman Rockwell published his autobiography titled My Adventures as an Illustrator. He expressed his frequent feelings of insecurity and fear of failure, despite being perceived by others as an emblem of American happiness. He articulated his persistent tension, the burden of deadlines, and his perfectionistic tendencies. However, he omitted a significantly more sinister aspect. Many now contend that he utilized amphetamines to maintain the rigorous work tempo. He depicted joyful families, quaint village life, and cheerful visages while silently contending with anxiety and despair in the background. The book omitted that section. It was a secure narrative, not the complete account. In 1951, Rockwell relocated his family to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Many believed it was solely for the tranquil environment. However, the reality was that his second wife, Mary, was gravely ill. She battled drinking and profound depression. She was receiving therapy at the Austin Riggs Center, a renowned psychiatric facility in the area. She had electroconvulsive treatment. Rockwell diligently labored to finance all expenses, undertaking a series of advertisements and magazine covers that contributed to her hospital fees. Although his artwork depicted an idealized America, his actual household was rife with anguish and trepidation. Stockbridge resembled a dream. They were present since it was one of the only locations offering the specific psychiatric assistance that Mary required. In 1953, a novel form of conflict emerged from within his own family. His son Peter publicly asserted that his father had been emotionally detached and preoccupied with his profession. It escalated into a controversy. However, correspondence subsequently discovered by Rockwell's grandson revealed an alternative narrative. They demonstrated that Norman had endeavored to be present. He assisted his boys, provided financial support for creative endeavors, and constructed a miniature studio for his eldest, Jarvis. Nonetheless, Norman's perfectionism occasionally prevailed. It took him over a year to complete one magazine cover, and he had to secure a loan from the bank to be solvent while he repeatedly repainted it. He desired perfection, although it resulted in a sacrifice of time with his family. In 1959, Mary unexpectedly succumbed to a heart attack. Norman was devastated. His melancholy manifested in his artwork, however, the magazines rejected it. They dismissed the more somber, emotionally charged works. They sought happiness. His physician, Eric Erickson, reportedly remarked, "You depict your delight, however you do not experience it." That was painful. He suppressed his emotions and continued to work, however it further exhausted him. In October 1961, Norman entered into matrimony again. His third spouse, Molly Punderson, was a retired educator. He was 67 years old, and she was 65 years old. He candidly informed others that he married her due to her organizational skills and his desire for assistance. He could no longer manage the commercial aspects of his art. Following years of grappling with Mary's affliction and his own psychological challenges, Molly restored tranquility and structure. The marriage astonished all, yet it endured until his demise. Perhaps it was not a romantic narrative. However, it provided him with stability during a period of significant need. Subsequently, 1963 arrived. After 47 years, Norman departed from the Saturday Evening Post. His final cover featured President John F. Kennedy following the assassination. In total, he has illustrated 321 covers for the magazine. However, Norman perceived that the world had transformed, necessitating his own adaptation. He grew weary of exclusively depicting joyful white families in his artwork. The journal prohibited the depiction of Black Americans unless they were relegated to the background or engaged in servile roles. He once stated, "I represented the optimal of all conceivable worlds. Such matters are no longer relevant." At the age of 69, he was prepared to articulate the reality. In 1964, he became affiliated with Look magazine. They granted him the liberty to depict his genuine concerns, civil rights, injustice, and authentic suffering. However, as soon as he commenced, the threats emerged. Individuals composed vitriolic correspondence. Some labeled him a traitor to his race. Others asserted that he would experience remorse if he continued to depict Black youngsters or portray prejudice. Certain dangers were so grave that his life was jeopardized, yet he persisted. At the age of 70, he persisted. In that same year, he depicted the issue that affects us all. It depicted Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old African-American child, accompanied by U.S. Marshals as she walked to school. On the wall behind her were derogatory remarks and a smeared tomato. It was astonishing. Readers were incensed. Thousands terminated their subscriptions. Rockwell employed a local girl as the model, yet the message was unequivocal. This was not the America that individuals desired to witness, yet it was the reality. Rockwell was ultimately conveying his true emotions. Throughout the 1960s, he endeavored to atone for his previous depictions of black individuals in subservient roles. He recognized his wrongdoing. He contacted civil rights organizations, engaged with activists, and ensured his new work was both respectful and factual. He sought to avoid being perceived as a white savior. He aimed to depict black individuals as protagonists of their own narratives. He paid attention. He transformed. Subsequently, in 1964, a catastrophic event occurred. 3 young civil rights activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were assassinated in Mississippi. They were attempting to register African American voters. The Ku Klux Klan and local law enforcement were responsible for it. Their remains were discovered interred in a reservoir. Rockwell was unable to sleep. He experienced nocturnal terrors. He infused all of it into a painting titled Murder in Mississippi. It depicted their concluding moments. Illuminated just by candles, with the silhouettes of the murderers encircling them. He refrained from engaging in any other activities for 5 weeks. The artwork was visceral and agonizing, yet he felt compelled to create it. In 1967, he depicted new children in the community. It depicted black and white youngsters encountering one another for the first time in a freshly desegregated community. It was serene, not wrathful, yet imbued with emotion. He was 73 years old and fatigued. Still continuing to struggle with his paintbrush. In 1978, an unusual occurrence transpired. 7 paintings by Rockwell were taken from a gallery in Minnesota. It became the most significant art theft in the state's history. Among the stolen artworks was Taking a Break, a painting from 1919. It was recovered in 2017, 4 decades later, within a residence in New Jersey. Acquired decades prior for a mere few bucks following damage incurred during a game of pool, Rockwell harbored other secrets. In 2013, biographer Deborah Solomon published a book asserting that he possessed concealed erotic drawings and may have harbored repressed sexual inclinations, potentially towards men. She referenced diary entries and notes, including one concerning a young assistant for whom he appeared to have a strong affection. Certain specialists saw these indications as authentic. Others, including Rockwell's granddaughter, asserted that the allegations were erroneous and unjust. The veracity remains ambiguous, although it has generated additional inquiries over his true identity outside the public persona. On January 10, 1977, President Gerald Ford awarded Rockwell the Presidential Medal